If you've ever stereotyped the Japanese as minimalistic, you can throw that theory out the window, especially if you look at their visual design, their houses, and especially their orthography. The Japanese writing system is quite something. It's the only orthography I'm familiar with that combines 3 separate scripts, one of which being a completely different type than the other two, mind you, and yet it somehow still kind of works. It's difficult to use for learners and natives alike, and I want to talk about this beautiful mess in today's video. If you're not familiar with how Japanese is written, this is a general overview. There are 2 syllabaries comprising about 50 characters each, which structurally work very similarly, their main differences being their functions and of course the actual shapes of the characters. There is also a set of a few thousand logographs, meaning that Japanese uses a mix of characters encoding meaning and characters encoding sound. How do they work together then? Well, in general, logographs are used for content words, at least the parts that are invariable. Hiragana is used for function words and inflections, and katakana is used for loans. This is of course a gross oversimplification, and we'll get to the details in a minute, but first it's important to understand how these scripts came to be and why. In reality, all 3 scripts originate from Chinese writing. See, people are lazy and they don't like coming up with entire writing systems for their languages, so they steal already existing ones and butcher them in order to make them usable for their respective languages. It happened in Europe with the Latin alphabet, and it happened in East Asia with Chinese characters. The main difference between the two is that the Latin script, being an alphabet with one glyph representing one sound for the most part, is much more flexible when adapting it to other languages. If you have a sound that the alphabet doesn't have a letter for, you can use digraphs or diacritics. Chinese writing works well for Chinese and not really anything else. For example, Chinese doesn't have inflections, so it doesn't have characters for inflections. Japanese has inflections, so the obvious question is, how do you encode them? Well, originally they would take Chinese characters and use them for their pronunciation rather than their meaning, and stuff them next to the main characters to convey the missing grammatical information. Then they realized that scribbling these characters into these tiny spaces was A, annoying, and B, made them borderline unreadable, so they simplified them by using only parts of them. And just like that, katakana was born, hence the name partial kana. Later, they decided that even this method is not great for your eyesight, so they just straight up moved these what used to be annotations into the main body of the text. Now, if you're wondering where hiragana came from, it evolved from ugly calligraphy that was used in informal writing. That's why it has all these curves and loops. Later, hiragana took over katakana's function in mixed writing, and by later, I mean less than 100 years ago, and katakana was repurposed to encode loanwords. There's much more to the history of these scripts. This is a very TLDR version, but it should give you a general idea of why things turned out the way that they did. Alright, let's talk about how these scripts are used in modern Japanese, at least in theory. What I'm about to present is the fun and regular part. Don't worry, we'll get to the shithousery later. We'll start with kanji. As mentioned previously, these characters are used to write content words such as nouns, stems of verbs and adjectives, as well as many Japanese personal names and place names. Along with adopting the Chinese script, Japanese has adopted a very large number of Chinese words as well, so it makes sense that this vocabulary would be written in its original orthography. However, the characters were also applied to native Japanese vocabulary, meaning that kanji could be read with an approximated Chinese pronunciation or a native pronunciation, generally when applied to Japanese equivalents of Chinese vocabulary. Although there are kanji for numbers, Arabic numerals are more common due to convenience, though large numbers are sometimes written with a mix of both. The only contexts where kanji numerals are required are compounds. Moving on to hiragana, this script is used to encode function words such as particles, conjunctions, and conjugatable endings of verbs and adjectives. This final usage is termed a kurigana. For instance, a verb's stem is written in kanji, which represents the meaning, and its ending is written in hiragana. When the verb is conjugated, the ending can be simply replaced with another one. Apart from that, hiragana is used for words with no kanji representation, such as onomatopoeia, or very common words which used to be written in kanji but are now written in hiragana due to frequent use. You can also use this script to replace kanji that are considered too difficult or obscure, although this kind of judgment is by nature arbitrary, and you might see cracks forming in the wall, but hold on, we're still going strong. Katakana, as many people may be aware of, is used to write anything foreign, apart from Chinese loans, which are written using Chinese characters. Duh. Except not really duh, because this only applies to loans borrowed a long time ago. Modern Chinese loans are kind of 50-50. In most cases, either spelling works. In addition, names of many animals and plants are written in katakana because the equivalent kanji tend not to be very useful for any other words, so no one bothers to remember them. Common animals and plants are exceptions, but not in scientific contexts where every species is written in katakana. You can also use katakana for onomatopoeia interchangeably with hiragana, and as a stylistic choice to convey informality, emphasis, or robot speech. Okay, so in theory, all this doesn't sound too bad, but here's where things become very haram. Let's talk about the two main types of character readings, native Japanese and Sino-Japanese. The latter are derived from how characters were presumably pronounced in China at the time of their borrowing. Here's where the first issue arises. In about the 5th or 6th century, the Japanese went to some place in China and copied the local pronunciations into Japanese. However, a few centuries later, they went to a different place in China where people spoke a different dialect, not to mention the pronunciation was changing over the centuries, brought them back and were like, these old pronunciations are no good. This is how these characters are pronounced now, and that is the only correct way. Replace the old readings. This idea was not super successful, although the newer pronunciations are definitely more common in modern Japanese, but both are still very much in use, and there's no way of telling which one to use. You just have to remember it on a word-by-word basis. This is especially annoying in common affixes like jin, or is it nin? But at least the two types of readings are never mixed together in one word, right? Wrong. As a side note, there is a batch of even newer pronunciations, but they are quite rare. Another issue with the Sinitic pronunciations is their relative lack of diversity. This is because while Chinese has tones and codas, or at least it did 1500 years ago, Japanese did not, meaning that a lot of readings were leveled when they entered Japanese, or later as it evolved further. This results in a large number of homophones, making Japanese writing reliant on Chinese characters for disambiguation. Now, you might be wondering, but spoken Japanese doesn't have kanji, how come anyone understands it? Good question, because I sure as shit don't. I can only read it. But apparently there are people who do, so there must be some trick to it. The serious answer is likely that spoken language tends to use fewer Chinese words which are more susceptible to homophony, as they are considered more formal, and also spoken language is usually set in a specific context, like a conversation, unlike written language which can just exist in separation, like on a billboard. Moving on to native readings, the most conspicuous thing is that one character can have quite a few possible pronunciations. Although if you look at it from the right perspective, this actually makes things easier. A Japanese speaker already knows all these words, so being able to encode them using one character rather than having to learn a separate one for each one is quite convenient. What isn't very helpful is that, unlike the examples on the left, sometimes the same character can be used for multiple words which are orthographically exactly the same. There are some words which have a different meaning based on whether you use native pronunciations or Chinese pronunciations. But hey, since native pronunciations are used in native words and Chinese pronunciations are used in Chinese loans, at least they can never co-occur within one word, right? Wrong. There are also instances where a single morpheme is encoded with multiple characters, and also instances where multiple morphemes are encoded with one. Another source of pain is sequential voicing. It's basically whenever you have a compound and the second element gets voiced. Is it encoded in any way in the orthography if the word is written with logographs? No. Is it predictable? No. Is it at least limited to native words? No. Speaking of changes on morpheme boundaries, let's take a look at Sino-Japanese readings again. We already know that they can sometimes undergo voicing, but that is only the tip of the iceberg. There's also gemination, which occurs between a character ending in ti or zi and a character starting with a consonant which can be geminated, of which there are 4. The same happens with k or ki, followed by a k, or an h, but only for like 2 characters. There are exceptions where gemination doesn't occur, particularly when applying affixes. As a side note, you might be wondering, why the hell does H geminate to P, and why does it voice to B? You might also be wondering why these three particles are pronounced like this, and not like the spelling would suggest. The reason for these two things is actually related. You see, a long time ago, the H row used to be the P row, and voiced to B, as God intended. However, at some point, P shifted to F, and later to H, except when geminated. Between vowels though, it shifted to W instead, and later W disappeared everywhere except before A. Words were later respelled to match the new pronunciations, except for these three common particles which retain their old forms. In fact, this character is now only used to write this particle, because the syllable it used to represent is no longer there. There is actually one more position in which P did not change its pronunciation, and that was after coda N. This is still evident in the modern language because a character whose pronunciation begins with H mutates to a P after a character with a coda N. Are there exceptions to this rule? Yes, but not many. Speaking of coda N, when it's followed by a character starting with a vowel or a semi-vowel, sometimes an additional N is inserted to make the pronunciation easier. This isn't super common, and of course is not predictable. Interestingly, in some cases, instead of an N, an M is inserted. This is because coda N historically corresponds to coda N and M in Middle Chinese, so the M is inserted if the original pronunciation ended with an M. And then there are cases where the language just says fuck you and presents you with completely irregular pronunciations. These are collectively called ateji, and encompass instances of both using characters for their pronunciation while disregarding their meaning, as well as using them for their meaning while disregarding their pronunciation. These latter cases are definitely more common, and many are well established. This non-standard usage is common in artistic writing, from 8th century poetry to 21st century edgy Vocaloid songs. I find it to be the most intriguing feature of the entire orthography, as it can be used to convey metaphors and deeper meanings, chuny though it may be. And then there are proper names, which are basically, whenever I see a name I just give up or assume every character I don't know is pronounced hiro. Let me go back to a term I introduced earlier in the video. I said that okurigana refers to the conjugatable ending of a verb or adjective written in hiragana. This is not exactly accurate because okurigana can span more than one syllable, but only the final syllable of a word undergoes conjugation. What's the point of including other syllables, you ask? Well, one of them is disambiguation. Because multiple words can be spelled using the same character, oftentimes when there's a transitive-intransitive verb pair, okurigana generally starts wherever the pronunciations diverge. Of course, this is not very regular, and sometimes you still get homographs, although in this case at least both verbs have different meanings, which cannot be said about these two. Another reason for polysyllabic okurigana is derivation. Derived words generally preserve the boundaries of the original word. Finally, we have historical reasons. When you learn about okurigana, you'll probably hear that the general rule is that okurigana includes only the final syllable for godan verbs and the final two syllables for ichidan verbs, provided that the verb is at least trisyllabic. This is because many ichidan verbs originally had a different base form, and their modern infinitives stem from one of several old conjugations. This is also the case for adjectives ending in "si". One other issue is that okurigana is not exactly set in stone, and many words permit more than one variant. This is often observed in verbal compounds. These examples will serve me as a segue to a more general observation about Japanese orthography, which is that it is quite flexible and many words can be spelled differently based on a number of factors. Sometimes different characters can be used to spell the same word to convey certain nuances, and although some are more obvious, commonly known and observed, there are other cases where the differences feel rather minute, not to mention the fact that sometimes they are not even consistently applied. Also, some verbs are written with characters when used on their own, but generally with hiragana when used as auxiliaries. But in many cases, spelling is just based on personal preference. This common word, although it has various spellings, is most commonly written like this or this. Does either of these spellings carry some meaning that is different from the other? Not really. It might be as simple as you being too lazy to convert the word when typing. I have noticed that the likelihood of a certain word being spelled with kanji or not can be traced on a scale. There are some words that I rarely see written in kanji, there are some which I rarely see spelled in hiragana, and there are some which are pretty much 50-50. There are also words, and I've mentioned this before, where some people mix the two scripts because a character is too hard or annoying to write, which looks horrible, but it's becoming less common because most people nowadays don't write things by hand, and there's no incentive to avoid complicated characters when typing. All things considered, it still could have been worse. After the Second World War, the Japanese stopped raping Chinese civilians and decided to work on their orthography instead. Remember how I mentioned the 3 particles that aren't written the way you pronounce them? Well, imagine the whole language being spelled like that. No half-size characters to show gemination or iotation, consonants which were now either silent or had a different quality, and outdated spellings of diphthongs before their eventual euphony. Another issue were the logographs. Similarly to the Chinese, the Japanese realized that simplifying characters is probably not a bad idea, so they did that. The simplifications were not as extensive as in China, but followed the same general principles of unifying spellings, removing components, replacing components, and adopting cursive or shorthand forms. The issue is, these simplifications were not uniform, and also only applied to about 2,000 characters they deemed most common. Another thing they did like 10 years later was respelling words using characters outside of their curated list with more common characters that had the same pronunciation, and honestly, thank fuck for that. These old spellings look like hell. Oh, by the way, there were of course inconsistencies. So why not just get rid of the characters altogether? Just do what the Koreans did. They switched to phonetic writing and adopted spaces between words, although they still haven't figured out how to use them properly. Well, the main issue is homophony. Unlike Japanese, Korean has more than like 8 syllables, so it can afford to get rid of Chinese writing in favor of their own alphabet. Ironically, Korean is actually much better suited to use them than Japanese is, at least to write Chinese loans. Most of the issues I mentioned when talking about Japanese are absent in Korean. Korean readings don't change due to voicing, gemination, or any other stupid shit. In addition, there are almost no characters with more than one possible reading, and almost no irregularities. However, personally I still find Japanese easier to read. This is mostly because I have more experience with it, but I also feel like kanji make words easier for me to recognize because they're more visually distinct, whereas if I look at Korean, it just looks like a bunch of sticks and circles. And so, despite it being severely retarded, I still have a huge soft spot for Japanese writing. Some things are beautiful because they are simple, elegant, and minimalistic, and some things are beautiful because they are not. Having so much depth in your orthography allows you to host nationwide spelling bees on crack, and ensures that you'll be learning how to read for the rest of your life. Japanese is the only foreign language I've had any success in, apart from English, and also the language that got me interested in linguistics, and the primary reason why I decided to learn it to begin with was my fascination with its writing. Or at least that's the half lie I tell people who ask me about it so they don't know how much of a loser I am.